Hey there, I'm going to show how I check the piston to valve clearance on a BMW M50 without taking the cylinder head off and accounting for the Vanos travel on the intake. So I've got a complete motor here all set up. This motor has Weisco pistons in it, which have fairly small valve reliefs, about kind of similar to like a stock M52 piston. And I've got 276 NM solid lifter cams in here. So these motors, if you run anything bigger than about, like a 265 or 270 degree intake camshaft, you do have to really be concerned about the piston to valve clearance, and you have to check that, especially if you're running stock pistons or any piston with small valve reliefs. And usually the problem is going to be on the intake with Vanos Advanced. You won't usually run into a problem on the exhaust unless you're running like a really crazy big cam or a really wild lobe center angle on the exhaust. It's usually the intake cam that you have to worry about. So that's what I'm going to check in this video. I will check the exhaust later off video just to see what I have for clearance, but I don't expect any issues there. So I'm going to check it on the intake because that's the problem child, and I'm going to simulate with the Vanos turned on. So I've done a bunch of calculating on this, and what I figured out is that on pretty much any setup, the tightest point of piston to valve clearance is going to be about 10 to 15 degrees after top dead center for the intake cam. So the reason for that is because right around that point in the rotation, the crank angle is almost straight up. So the piston has very little speed, but the intake valve is fully on the open ramp, and the intake valve is actually accelerating at the piston, even though the piston is starting to move down. But the intake valve will be moving faster than the piston, so it will outrun the piston. Once you get to like 15 to 20 degrees after top dead center, that's the point where the piston is out accelerating the intake valve, and then you're kind of free and clear. So because I know that the tightest point will be 10 to 15 degrees, that's the only point I check. Because if you have sufficient clearance there, you'll have sufficient clearance everywhere else. So I've got the crankshaft here set at 12 degrees after top dead center. And the reason I did 12 degrees is because on the trigger wheel on the front of these with 60 teeth on the trigger wheel, 360 divided by 60 is 6 degrees. So 2 teeth on the trigger wheel is 12 degrees from top dead center. So I've also got the cams in, and this intake cam is ground on a 109 degree lobe center angle, and I don't want to run a 109 degree lobe center angle. I know that I'm not going to do that. So I'm actually planning to retard this cam 6 degrees. So I've got my cam timing block. It's hard to get an angle here with my camera holder. I've got one of my custom timing blocks that I make set for 6 degrees retard, because that's where I plan to run this cam. So if you were doing this on whatever cam you're going to run and you're planning on using the factory blocks, then you would just set the cam with the factory block. But because I know that I'm going to retard the cam already, I'm going to check it that way. So now with the crankshaft 12 degrees after top dead center, if this was actually in the motor with the timing chain on it, when we turn the crank to 12 degrees, the camshaft would have turned along with it because they're tied together with the chain, of course. So the camshaft would have turned half the angle of the crankshaft because it spins at half the speed. So the camshaft would have spun, it would have advanced 6 degrees, so half of the crankshaft angle. So I need to advance the cam another 6 degrees, that's clockwise rotation, and then I also want to simulate the Vanos travel. So the Vanos on these motors turns the cam 25 degrees lobe center angle. That's measured at the crankshaft. The angle that the Vanos advances it measured at the camshaft is half of that. So the cam itself actually rotates 12.5 degrees with Vanos on. So we're going to rotate the cam that 6 degrees to match the crank angle, 12.5 degrees for the Vanos travel, and then we also need to rotate it a little bit extra to make sure that we have enough clearance. So I've done a bunch of measuring on a bunch of different cams, and a general rule of thumb, what I found is that the cams will lift, most cams will lift the intake valve about 40 thousandths of an inch with 8 degrees of crankshaft rotation. That's true for just about any cam, plus or minus a few thousandths of an inch. So I'm gonna run a minimum of 40 thousandths of an inch of piston to valve clearance on the intake. I would want more clearance than that on the exhaust, but with on the intake side, you can run them fairly tight. On the exhaust side, you can run into a valve flow problem that if the exhaust valve is floating when the piston's coming up on top dead center, you can have the piston outrun the exhaust valve and run into the valve. But that can't happen on the intake side because the cam is pushing the valve open at top dead center, whereas top dead center on the exhaust cam, the springs are pulling the valve shut. So like I said, about 40 thousandths of an inch, 1 millimeter is about the minimum that I'm comfortable with for piston to valve clearance on the intake. So like I said, 8 degrees of crankshaft rotation is about enough to get you that 40 thousandths of an inch. So half that rotation at the camshaft, 4 degrees at the camshaft, is enough to account for our clearance. So we have 6 degrees to match the crank rotation where we have the harmonic balancer set, 12.5 degrees to account for the Vanos travel, and another 4 degrees for the valve clearance. Now, one thing that you might be thinking is, what if I don't have a solid lifter set up like this motor has in it? What if I'm running the stock hydraulic lifters? Well, I've done a bunch of measuring on that too, and here's a factory hydraulic lifter. Like this lifter doesn't have any oil in it, so you can see I can depress that lifter in there. If this was in the motor right now, there would be about 40 thousandths of an inch of piston travel that's possible with this. So if you're doing this on a motor and you don't know if the lifters are pumped up all the way, you have to account for that you might be crushing the lifters when you're checking this. You probably are, in fact. So you have to add a little bit of extra to account for that. So another 4 degrees will account for the potential for crushing the lifters. So in total here, if I'm measuring this on a motor with solid lifters, I want to rotate the intake camshaft 22.5 degrees. If I can rotate the intake camshaft clockwise 22.5 degrees, then I know I have enough piston to valve clearance. If I'm doing it on a hydraulic lifter motor and I want to be extra conservative and make sure that, I account for the hydraulic lifters being able to be crushed, I'm going to do 26.5 degrees. So to measure this, I've got another phone here that's got an angle finding app. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my timing block off the back of the cam, and I'm going to find the 0 here. So I don't think this is going to show up on the video, but this says 43 degrees on here right now. So I'm going to rotate the cam another 22.5 degrees. So I want to be able to go to, it'd be 6, let's see. Oh, it's going to subtract from this 43 degrees. So now I have to do math. I need to be able to rotate this to 20 degrees. If I can rotate this clockwise until this goes from 43 degrees to 20 degrees, then I know that I'll have enough piston to valve clearance. So actually what I'm going to do, I'm just going to rotate the cam, and I'm going to do this gently with some mechanical sympathy, and I'm just going to rotate it gently until I feel it stop. You'll feel a very definite stop when the valves touch the pistons, and then I'm just going to stop, don't keep torquing on it, If you really reef on it, you could bend something, but just gently touching the piston isn't going to bend anything. So I'm just going to rotate this. There, I felt it stop. So I'm going to go back and make sure that that's really what I felt. Yep, right there. I felt a very definite stop of the valves touching the pistons. So open my angle app here again. And I am at exactly 20 degrees. So with full Vanos travel, with the cam starting out 6 degrees retarded, I hadn't measured this already, so this was just by coincidence, but I'm at exactly my minimum clearance. So in order for me to run this cam in this motor with this piston combination, the intake cam has to start out 6 degrees retarded or more. If I were to install it with the factory blocks, I would have a piston to valve clearance issue. I would most definitely hit the pistons with Vanos Advanced. So what do you do? Let's say that I ran out of piston to valve clearance there. Let's say that, 2 degrees from the number that I was trying to get to, I felt the valves touch the pistons. So if that were the case, then I need to retard the intake camshaft by that many degrees. So 2 degrees measured at the camshaft here would actually be 4 degrees measured at the crankshaft. So if I was 2 degrees short here, I would retard the intake cam by 4 degrees. So like the alignment blocks that I make, here's the 4 degree retard block I had sitting on the table here. I would use this timing block on the intake cam, and then I would be fine. The other thing you can do is, if you don't want to retard the intake cam anymore, you can take apart the Vanos unit and you can put a shim inside the Vanos unit to limit the travel. So I've done this before. I don't remember exactly how much shim thickness changes the angle, but you can figure it out fairly easily. If you make like an aluminum shim to go inside the Vanos unit, you can restrict the Vanos travel to say like 15 degrees or 20 degrees lobe center angle, and then you'll be okay that way too. But in this case, I'm happy with where I'm at. I'm planning to run this cam at 6 degrees retarded anyway. That gives me a 116 degree lobe center angle, which is kind of where I want to be anyway. So I'm not going to limit the Vanos travel. I'm just going to run it as is with the intake valve, or the intake cam retarded 6 degrees. So that's all there is to it. I know that the math is difficult to follow on all of this camshaft stuff. I work on it like almost every day, so it's kind of second nature to me, but I do realize that it's kind of difficult to understand. So maybe if you have a question, if you leave a comment below, I can do my best to try to answer it. So okay, that's the way that I do it. Good luck.